Okay, with the way things are going, I'm getting ready for when I pull up the National Park Service webpage to look for another cool spot to highlight and getting a 404 message. Honestly, I don't know. But this is why I'm doing this. The National Park Service and the surrounding agencies provide a window into our history, the rocks and the landforms, the plants, the animals, and the human activities, and how they all interact across time, and make some very beautiful places accessible to everyone. Because they have a pretty small advertising budget, our national parks and their auxiliary historical places are often fairly invisible to the average American. Letting people know that they have access to all this wonder seems even more important. So, the NPS is currently still with us, and this week's peep into our public past has been inspired by the 19th century pigs. In this time period, it is impossible to ignore how these swine are inextricably intertwined with the plantation economy of the soggy, low-country Southeast. Pigs were absolutely essential to feeding the enslaved workforce of captive Africans on plantations. To that end, I am introducing a compare and contrast of two neighboring projects on old plantations north and south of Alexandria, Louisiana. For those of you a little rusty on your Louisiana geography, if you think of the state as a boot, Alexandria is right at the ankle bone, or about a 2.5-hour drive from Baton Rouge, which is at the top of the Laces, or 3.5 hours from the toe, where you'll find New Orleans. And the area around Alexandria is sodden. Rivers and canals and lakes and marshes and bayous lace through the area. There are no cellars around here because they would immediately fill with water. And it's also Steel Magnolias country for fans of the movie. But it also means this area has been a place that people have been growing and harvesting food from for thousands of years. And in the ages of America, it has been a great place to grow water-hungry crops, like rice and sugar and all manner of fruits and vegetables. This area is home to some of the very best tomatoes. With that in mind, it makes sense that the area is littered with large historical farm sites, and that there would be at least 2 preserved, and in fact there are many in the area. On the looking back side, there's the National Park Service that oversees Magnolia Plantation at the Cane River Creole National Historical Park. Most of the history available looks at the French-descended Creole landowners who were living in the area. The people who lived in the big houses directed the work on the farm and literally lived off the labor of others. It's undeniable the land is beautiful, the houses are impressive, and piles of money were made off the tons of plant products that were shipped out of the area on the Red River down to New Orleans to head out to the wider world of global commerce. But that's also a story that has been told many times in many places with lots of fancy chairs and leaded glass windows. And it holds a piece of time in stasis. Then there's the using lessons from history to move forward vision at the Jubilee Justice Project at Inglewood Farm, which is working to learn and grow from the past. This ancestral land of the Natchez and Ovoyo people, which has been growing food for thousands of years, is now being used to learn how to grow rice regeneratively. Knowing that this area is rich deep down and is good at growing food means that they are taking advantage of natural cycles that grow rice without hauling in tons of manufactured fertilizer. And unlike what went on here for about 250 years, those leading the work and growing the food are directly benefiting from that work. The Jubilee Justice Farm is showing how community networking and working with historically fertile lands in regenerative ways can make the land vital, grow food, connect community, provide livelihoods, and tables full of delicious food. So pack up your farm shoes and a hat that can provide some shade and venture into the rich river lands around Alexandria, Louisiana. You can see a window to the past in the Cane River Creole National Historical Park, as well as a working farm at Jubilee Justice, using the knowledge of the land and the past to build a vital future. Both have important things to teach us, but only one can hook you up with the good tomatoes. Episode 138, Early 19th Century Pigs, Greasing the Way to the Future. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at a number of the important roles swine played in moving post-colonial America into mechanical age America. And I was surprised by the number of ways and places piggies show up, even before we get to the railroad slaughterhouse concentration at the end of the century. To see all the places that piggies are important to the growth of the U.S., pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that at this point in American history, we are not a beef nation, and chicken is still a special occasion dish, something you serve to people who matter to you. In the early 19th century, we are a country that runs on pork. That's right, it's pig flesh that runs the world, and lard smooths it out. Pigs may be less common in city streets, and the hog catcher mostly is called to poorer neighborhoods. And 19th century ephemera shows that pigs wandering the streets were a sign of a poor neighborhood, something the emerging middle class complained about. Every single backyard no longer has a pig as its compost disposal system, and there's some class consciousness about it. Everyone might be eating pork all the time, but no longer is everyone raising it. The shift is on from a farm with a pig to pig-raising farms. Just as the old tobacco farms of Virginia and surrounds were turning into dairy farms when the soil fertility gave out, the same thing is happening up in the farms of the foothills that people moved to as the borders of the country grew. So it's time to look at who's growing pigs and who's eating pigs, how and what parts, and how the pigs of 19th century America are changing along with the country. Back in the last few seasons, I spoke of the rather terrifying and relatively feral pig of earliest America. These forest and street-dwelling swine were active critters, always on the verge of going wild once again, and many did. But these were hunted as part of the whole fair chase doctrine by colonials, New Americans, and the longtime locals, labeled Indians by said geographically challenged New Americans. European culture contributed salt pork in barrels and indifferently smoked bacon. But local knowledge and barbacoa tradition created the hickory smoked ham, and African love of vinegar and peppers, not to mention a keen understanding of keeping meat good in steamy climates, brought us the earliest inklings of American-style barbecue. I mean, right from the start, the southeast of the New America was the collision point of many pork and cooking traditions that would create food styles that will become underpinnings of American food traditions. And I can't help but notice that over the ages, there was a lack of excitement about preserving pickled pork in the face of smoked and spiced options. But back in the early 19th century, there's still plenty of pickled or barreled salt pork to go around. The indifferent back-of-the-fireplace smoked bacon is largely gone, but that's mainly due to people having the wood and space to build proper smokehouses. Nobody ever really wanted that soot-covered, indifferent so-called bacon. But why not beef and cows, you ask? Well, relative to pigs, cows are fragile and slow to grow. I mean, yes, there are cows running feral in soon-to-be Texas, in the forests further north. Bears and wolves have the chops to hunt them. And even more importantly to the 19th century farmer, a cow only produces 1 or maybe 2 calves a year. And they are so picky about food. Did you know cows are vegans when given any choice in the matter? And are fussy about just which grasses they eat when out on the open range? And these animals with their roots in semi-tropical plains environments are useless when it comes to finding their own food in the snow. Pigs, on the other hand, they'll not only take on a wolf, they are voracious omnivores at all times. And they only gestate for about 4 months, so can easily produce 2 litters of 8 to 12 piglets every single year. That means while you might get 1 or 2 new cows, you can increase your piggies by over a dozen. And they aren't so picky about food. So if you're looking for a fast multiplying meat source, bovines ain't it. Not to mention that pork takes to smoke and salt cures much more tastily. It has to do with all that fat. I mean, look at the animal facts regarding meat wandering around. In the 19th century, we almost did in the American bison population sheerly out of spite. But here in the 21st century, we are losing the fight and being invaded by the tricksy, hard-bristled, tusk-wielding feral pigs both from the South and the North. I mean, look up southern feral hogs and Canadian super pigs to see the problems I'm describing. But back in the 19th century, the pig invasion was not so dire. We were working up to creating our current problems. Instead, what people are spending time worrying about was creating a less terrifying pig that was suited for their particular needs and location. And so I bring you the pig drive versus the lard hog. Let's start with the pig drives because these were happening with an older style pig, closer to the heritage pigs that showed up with the Spanish in the old days and the earliest American colonists. The old school pigs that were dropped off on our shores were smallish piggies that were all set up to mostly feed themselves. They were relatively fleet of foot, as they were prepared to wander about the landscape all day snuffling up food in the form of nuts, roots, worms, and whatnot. These guys were relatives of the style of pig currently bred to produce meaty things like Spanish jamon, Italian prosciutto, porchetta, and so on, where the meat is the primary product and the fat, while important, is secondary. This longer-legged and relatively leaner style of hog was also important because the only way to get pigs to market so someone could purchase one of them, or cuts of said swine, was to get them to walk there. Yes, despite the cattle drive being the fodder for every movie character that transfers animals from point A to point B, like the Pony Express, the cattle drive period was actually shorter-lived than we think. The majority of it happened within a 15-year period between when cattle ranching started in earnest and the railroads swooped in to haul them to their disassembly. It was truly the pig drive that has a long history and moved a mighty number of animals. Mark Essig's book, Lesser Beasts, A Snout-to-Tail History of the Humble Pig, delves into the hog drive phenomenon. It pointed out that when Tennessee was the Wild West, that is, the early 1800s, right where we are, hog drives were a common occurrence starting in about the 1820s. And during that time, Americans were raising more pigs than any other sort of animal, chickens included. Toll gate records for one location in North Carolina for the year 1847 records the passage of 692 sheep, 898 cattle, 1,317 horses, and 51,753 hogs. Hogs, in fact, were one of the first products from out west, the West being Ohio and Kentucky at this point, to be brought back to the East to be sold. And if you think about it, in these days of terrible roads, it kind of makes a lot of sense. Saleable grain was concentrated into liquor since it had to be carried, but the hogs could carry themselves. And when they were pen-fed, they ate and thrived on the easiest food to give them, corn, which grew very well, and scraps from the preparation of human food. Or another way to look at them, pigs were concentrated grain all by themselves. As quoted by Essig, a visitor to Chicago in 1867 made note that, "What is a hog but 15 or 20 bushels of corn on 4 legs?" And for those of you a little creaky in old-timey measurements, a bushel is about 56 pounds, 20 kilos, or about 2 of those 5-gallon buckets. The hog drive was so well established, from Tennessee across the Blue Ridge Mountains, through the river town of Asheville, North Carolina, and out to the cotton and rice lands of the agricultural southeast, that there was a line of drovers' inns, each about 10 miles apart. That's about a day's walk for a pig. This is where the pig drives would stop, drink water, get some snooze and a meal. Pies and stew for the men, and bushels of hard corn for the pigs. And any pig that went lame on the trail, those were dropped off at a given inn as partial payment for the supplies and a roof for the night. And we are given the idea that plantations were self-sustaining operations that also pumped out a cash crop of some sort. And some kind of were in their early days, but as the internal trade networks were set up, cotton, rice, and indigo plantations leaned on their cash crops and imported much of the food they fed to their enslaved workers. The same way the sugar plantations of the Caribbean changed the rotation of salt cod and helped gut the fish industry, the plantation economies of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina ran on pigs walked in from poorer farmland in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio. Mount Airy, North Carolina, of Mayberry and Andy Griffith fame, was built up partly as a stop on a major hog transport route. And that meteor-created Cumberland Gap in Kentucky that let post-Revolutionary War immigration out through the Appalachian Range was now a conduit for hogs back in to the main population centers. And so was the Natchez Trace. And these are both locations I covered in some of my National Park Service promos. See, it is all connected. As trains began to crisscross the country in the subsequent decades, the long drives of pigs will dwindle. These hogs no longer have to walk from Ohio to Baltimore. But there are no trains, and there will be no trains to get through the Appalachians and the Blue Ridge until coal. And even then, those won't carry very many pigs. So while the flatland pig drives die down, pigs will continue to stroll the byways of the mountains. In those places where trains arrive, it changes things. Pigs no longer have to walk 500 or 200 or even 100 miles. The need for them to have hiking powers is lessening. In fact, from a farming perspective, pigs with less ability to wander about is attractive. And as more people with more practice frying foods are put in charge of cooking more food for the elites, the demand for cooking fat also rises. That's right, West Africans have a long history of frying foods. In Europe, at this point, there is a bit of frying, but for the most part, it is shallow sauté, the browning of some breadcrumbs, and an occasional sweet treat, like a fritter, a beignet, an oil cake, or a donut. But the deep frying of savory foods was born where plant fats ruled, where seed oils and the oils crushed from fruits and nuts were common. While olive oil ran the Mediterranean world, large constellations of plant oils for food, for medicine, for hair care, for skin care, for cosmetic purposes, for worship, are to be found anywhere there is rich plant life on the African continent. And it was this practice of frying savory foods submerged in oil, practiced by enslaved cooks and served on the tables of the wealthy, that truly brought the hunger for deep-fried foods to the attention of the American. But to deep fat fry, you need, well, deep fat. Up to this point, the only fat sources in America are animal fats, butter, tallow, lard, goose grease, and there's really not that much to go around. You'll note that not many people are talking about the rich fat reserves to be found on deer. Only bear fat could compare, and let's face it, a bear is harder to catch and manage for butchery. Not to mention, they are honestly getting a bit thin on the ground. It is the rise of the railroads and the subsequent lessening of the need to get your pigs to market on foot, plus this rise for the demand in fat, that creates the conditions for the American lard hog. While the long-distance wandering hog was raised in about 3 years to a sale weight of around 200 pounds or just under 100 kilos, new breeds of lard hogs were being developed that were even better at converting feed to meat and to fat. And the market weight of these pigs could be up above 250 pounds, which they would reach in even less time than their leaner brethren. But the deep fat fry being on the rise wasn't the only reason the lard hog was developed. Far from it. In many places, lard has been just as important a part of the pig as the meat. In fact, the word larder, the place where we keep our food, emerges from the word lard, which for many years was the most important item in there. I mean, while I have multiple times cited the fact of boiled food and made ew, ick noises about the use of the recovered fat or slush from the top of a cauldron full of said boiled food, the truth is that that fat, recovered and reused in food or moved on to other purposes such as soap and candles, was part of the reason only rich people had spit roasted meat. Sure, it was partly a fireplace size thing, but it was also true that only the rich could afford to let their fat literally go up in smoke. The rest of the people would happily boil and stew their ducks and pork shoulders so they could skim the fat for later use. Which really means that the world's grandmas have been keeping a coffee can of bacon drippings even before there were coffee cans or hickory smoked bacon. And The rise of the lard hog means something else in the non-food landscape. It's not just that the steel rails of the American Railroad are transporting the hogs. The hogs themselves are providing the grease that keeps the machines moving. This development was introduced to me when I visited the original DuPont gunpowder factory. That's right, the roots of the American chemical giant lie in a gunpowder factory founded by French émigrés getting out from under the rise of the terror and such. The original factory, built alongside Brandywine Creek in Delaware for the water power and the black willow that made superior charcoal for making gunpowder, currently exists as a museum. Along with the many informative exhibits is a working machine shop where they show you how to carve a gear out of a cast iron blank. And as you are standing there, you notice in this stream-side shop that the machinery is shiny where the gears come in contact with each other, and in places where wheels and shafts spin. In the 19th century, keeping all that cast iron from grinding against itself and from rusting, well, lubrication and waterproofing were essential. And one material widely available in the rural areas of Pennsylvania and the Delmarva Peninsula would have been lard. Delmarva is Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, by the way. As the mechanization of America, especially in the Northeast, was spinning up, something had to make sure the gears weren't grinding, the skids were sliding, and the rails were running. Which means, when a few episodes ago I made the contention that America is made of bread and steel, it's true the prairies were opened up to cultivation by the steel plow and wheat for bread came flowing out. But more corn than wheat was planted, and a large portion of that corn was shipped back as pork, and in amounts that were absolutely unimaginable anywhere in the contemporary world. To get to the amounts of meat moving around a political state, one would need to go back to the massive military and banqueting operations of things like the Assyrian kings, the Chinese kingdoms, the Persian shahs, the Egyptian pharaohs or Roman emperors. In the Western-facing world of our 19th century Americans, there is no place where meat raising, processing, and eating was available at the scale it is about to be in America. Europe, up until this time, was claiming superiority in all manner of livestock raising. Better horses, American ones were still pretty puny and not that pretty. Better cows, theirs were giving far more and much higher fat milk, and better sheep with higher quality wool. But even they had to concede that Americans had developed a better pig, bigger, fatter, and faster growing. They had a better feed-to-weight conversion rate. In other words, less feed made more pig and faster. It was with these advancements in the animal, in the mechanical, and where the two cross over that make early 19th century America firmly the Republic of Porkdom. And we are going to have so many pigs. Some of the next large developments will fall under the category of turning pigs from a community project into a product that pays. The large-scale slaughterhouse that features in the downfall of pork and later will make small-scale meat raising almost impossible is born right here in the early 19th century to accommodate the arrival of the large lard hog on the train. Oh no, I haven't even gotten to what parts of the pig are being eaten by who and how and where. Which means this week, we're just going to end here. It was all about the wandering pig and the lard greasing the way. And it'll be next episode that's for cooking, which is what I will get to. Where is the meat going? What parts are the good parts? Or at least what were the good parts then? And just how much pork was a proper American consuming? Thanks for listening. Now, speaking of quibbles and corrections, a listener reached out to me about the War of 1812 to Civil War cracker connection. And I realized that in the writing, I had squashed together too many facts and created a complete mistake. It turns out that the old crackers that showed up in Civil War supplies were actually from the 1846 to 48 Mexican-American War, so only about 10 years old. Some of the factories that would come to make up the earliest versions of Nabisco, like Pearson's & Son and the Josiah Bent Bakery, sent these out as they were ramping up production for the Union Army. However, leftovers from the Civil War churned out in 1865, those were resurrected 30 years later for the Spanish-American War. Talk about clearing out old inventory. And you can find examples of these for sale in auction houses, hardtack manufactured for the Civil War with inscriptions from the 1898 Spanish-American War. Whether all of these are authentic, I won't comment on that in these degenerate days, but these artifacts have been around long enough for the tradition to have formed. And you can see authentic preserved examples of hardtack in different institutions dedicated to not letting anyone forget the Civil War, despite there being many other wars America fought in that we have almost entirely forgotten. So thank you, and I hope that clears that up. Further email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. As always, downloading the episodes helps me know that you're out there, but even better than that are your reviews. And I appreciate your thoughtful comments and questions. I'm still trying to find out how to get a better question in the Spotify comments section, and one of these days, Apple Podcasts will allow me to see comments from outside the US instead of showing me an error message. I'll keep trying. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, and elsewhere as @THOA Food, and all of this information is available in the show description.